So, thank you, David Clements, for joining us here at the stream to discuss a most unexpected and welcome election result. I thought we were going to be having a very different conversation today. Didn't you?
I did. I was actually bracing myself for the worst of all outcomes, thinking that there was a small possibility that we would enjoy the victory that we did. I thought that the victory would come, but it would be after a ton of battles in the courtroom. Didn't think we'd see a concession from the mainstream media. But I've got some insights on to why I believe that's the case and why I don't think we're out of the woods just yet. But
Yeah,
uh,
that's what I wanted to talk to you about because you, along with a number of other people I really respect, who've fought heroically to expose election fraud, to show the public just what was done to us in 2020 via the voting machines and other means of electoral fraud. Uh, I think you and Emerald Robinson and a bunch of other people have who knew intimately that the mechanisms by which our elections have been corrupted. We're predicting that there would be a steal on the level of 2020 or larger.
mhm.
Um, why do you think they couldn't get away with it? First of all, why couldn't they get away with it? Or did they
Yes.
decide not to?
So the big weapons that the radical left has had at the disposal um, are as follows: the power of the narrative, because they have a stranglehold on the legacy media, and then the rigged infrastructure. And you need to have both. So what was really cool about yesterday was that the weapon of the narrative has been destroyed by Donald Trump. And the most concrete example of how he destroyed the narrative was that many people just took it at face value that Democrats win on early voting, Republicans win on election day voting.
Right. I
And
think we both believed that too, didn't we?
I didn't. And I'll tell you why I didn't,
Oh,
because
okay. All right.
it's not true. It's
Okay.
actually not true. What happened is that there was a seeding. There was a planting of a seed in 2020 early on, where we started hearing over and over that Democrats prefer mail-in voting, and it virtually materialized out of nowhere. And John, if you actually stop and think about it, when did you first hear that Democrats preferred the method of voting by mail? It was 2020. I would really challenge you to go and say, man, in 2010, there was this huge thing where Democrats embraced mail ballots. It's not true. But to support that claim, when we did audits in New Mexico, which is historically a purple/blue state, we started researching for a data set going back 30 years to see if, in fact, Democrats preferred voting by mail over Republicans. And what we found is it's absolute hogwash. It's indistinguishable. There's like a 1 percentage point advantage to the Democrats, but there were actually years where Republicans preferred to use mail-in voting more than Democrats. And so the data did not align with the narrative. But be that as it may, the narrative was out there, and most people said, well, I guess there's a plausible reason why we can wait for mail-in ballots that were casted during early voting to be counted at the very end. And after the next 10 days of counting votes, what do you know? Biden won. So that was part of their plan to create a psyop in the minds of voters to say, okay, what you're seeing is not as salacious as you might think because we have prepared you for this outcome. Well, when we started looking at the objective metrics coming out of the data sets, what we found is Republicans were voting early at a pace that far exceeded what the Democrats were doing in 2020. And we took that from them. Coincidentally, there was no narrative for Democrats to get out the vote and vote on election day. So what you saw was dominance from Republicans, both in early voting and on election day. And that's what presented the problem. So at this point, it wasn't so much about whether or not the Democrats could use the rigged infrastructure to generate fake ballots. Their problem was no one would believe it based on the data that was coming in real time.
Do
And
you think
it's
also the fact that Elon Musk bought X and bought Twitter and X and created an alternative medium that could not be suppressed?
that was a huge part of it. And I think that goes back to narrative busting. you can't say that Trump was this pariah when he's got an endorsement from Joe Rogan, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, a broad swath of Democrats and independents. And what did you have on the other side? All you had were endorsements from celebrities that were attending P. Diddy parties.
That's right.
And so,
Virtually all of the people on PDD's guest lists were Kamala Harris backers. If you add in the fact that 300,000 children, immigrant children, have disappeared since under Harris Biden, just disappeared, unaccounted for. 300,000 kids from Mexico and Honduras are just somewhere being sexually exploited or working in sweatshops, doing God knows, having God knows what done to them. The Democrats are the party of human trafficking and
yeah.
Hollywood sex parties.
So I guess in finishing up the thought that I had was the architecture follows the narrative. And after we throw a monkey wrench into the narrative, there's a point where, in fact, you could have a too big to rig. And I need to provide a little bit of nuance. It's not too big to rig from the standpoint that they could have generated fake ballots and do all the things that we described in Let My People Go. But the data sets that were out there, the polls, the locations that were being manned, the rallies, there's just too many things out there that did not jive with an outcome. And one of the things that's ironic, John, is that we were prepped for this idea that we were going to be counting ballots 10, 11, and 12 days after the election day. And wouldn't you know, as soon as we broke their narrative, all of a sudden it wasn't a problem. I mean, think about how silly that is. We're preparing us in Maricopa County for 2 weeks of counting the mail-in ballots, and then they cut their loss. They cut their losses because we overwhelmed the rig. And so I think that's the answer why, but it doesn't mean that we've won. And this is the caveat, that there are many down ballot races that were stolen. Wisconsin, there are Senate races that should be allocated to the GOP when we look at the numbers that our experts are looking at right now, that there were a ton of races that were still affected. And so my worst fear,
Democrats might take the House. The Democrats very well may take the House, which would mean that Trump would be crippled in office and would have 4 miserable years of accomplishing almost nothing.
Well, they're looking for that. So my worst fear scenario is this, because of course I believe that Trump was going to win somehow. I just thought it was going to get a lot dirtier, and maybe the dirtier fights are going to happen in the weeks and months ahead. I mean, I think your sentiment over the House could be exactly what they strive for, to neuter a Trump presidency. But be that as it may, we've got a problem here where if you're conservative Inc., you can basically say, see, Clements was wrong. Emerald was wrong. The elections aren't that rigged. And because Trump got in. And so what you do is you start creating the siren song of the Pyrrhic victory for the radical left is, let's just keep the damn machines. Let's keep the software. Let's keep the mail-in ballot structure. Let's placate Trump, surround him with all of our people. And when he's finally out because he can't run again, we can start it back up. And so there's a wiser course to what the Democrats did this time. They actually did something that we didn't know. Were they going to go balls out crazy and just go for the jugular and inflate ballots, and it doesn't matter how silly it looks? Or do they rein it in and saying, like, our own survival actually relies on our ability to basically take it for the next 3.5, 4 years, survive, but keep the machines in place. And unfortunately, there's all kinds of advisors around Trump, and they're not going to be talking about the machines and the software. So it's my job in the next 4 years to continue pounding the desk that I want paper ballots. I want same day elections. And Lord willing, if we get that, you're actually going to see that the victory today, as much of a landslide as it was far greater than what was reported.
People are going on. Steve Bannon said, where are the extra 10 million votes the Democrats got last time? Did they ever even exist? Did the re-election of Donald Trump prove in most people's, will it prove to most people that 2020 was rigged? And can we use that to get rid of the infrastructure of vote fraud for next time?
I hope so. In fact, Draza Smith, who was a PID grid cybersecurity expert out of Sandia National Labs, always talked about the need to inflate both Democrat and Republican numbers. And this is kind of confusing, but there's a percentage kind of weighting where depending on what someone does, you apply more votes to the other category. And so when you look at what happened in 2020, you have like this outlandish 74 million votes for Trump and even more outlandish 81 million votes for Biden. And when you look at the voter registration file, that's effectively 95% of the registered voter base.
Which never happens.
It's never happened. It's about a 30-point increase over historical norms projections. So
and this was during COVID lockdowns.
During COVID. And so then you look at the returns last night of, 68 million to 60 million. I know the numbers are still fluctuating right now, but there's what, 25, 20, about close to 25 million votes that aren't accounted for in a more consequential race than 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's really hard to believe, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it tells me that something happened, and that might have been miraculous in nature. What I did see was that there were outages of some of these integrated softwares throughout the country. New Mexico had a statewide outage through the system that used voter registration. And if that happened, that might have handicapped the ability to digitally inflate the record and have that tied to a ballot and generate that to be submitted in the election.
Maybe what we need is get some white hat hackers to cripple all the election software so it can't be used.
Well, I'll tell you this. Last night I was doing a bunch of podcasts, and wouldn't you know, in my email box was a news correspondent from NBC News National, and they're already busy working on the next narrative, which is, David, now that Trump won, are you ready to say that there's nothing wrong with the election system? Because obviously you're going to want him to go forward and be inaugurated. And I responded the way that I always do, which is I'd be happy to answer your questions in a video recorded interview to be published in its entirety. But what I would tell her, and what I'm going to tell your audience right now, is that I would be perfectly fine if the Democrats are upset about the election, how it was administered yesterday, to get everything redone for one day using paper ballots with no machines. And what you'd find out is that Trump would have won every single state. So I actually invite the scrutiny on the systems. And I would love it if Trump called their bluff, or if there was an opportunity to do that. It doesn't look like that's going to happen, but that was one of the wargaming things I was looking for, is if it was close and there wasn't a concession, it would be gangster if Trump just said, fine. We obviously can't trust these machines, all of these problems. Let's go back and do it the old fashioned way. Let's set up a special election in December, winner take all. And I think he would have been vindicated that way.
Yeah. So what is our next step as election integrity activists, as citizens concerned about this? Do we go for a federal law banning the vote machines? Do we do it state by state?
I think today, celebrate, gloat, give the proverbial middle finger to all the trolls that have been treating this like garbage for 4 years, because these victories don't come along very often. Your question, I think, has more to do with the constitutional structure of how elections are supposed to be administered. And under the 10th Amendment, Article 1, Section 8, there's not a whole lot that's left to the states in the administering of elections. There is a small nugget because you have federal races, but they've been left to the states. I think that should continue, but I would love to see strict adherence to the federal laws that we already have on the books, meaning you've got this thing called FISMA, which is basically your critical infrastructure law that we don't follow. If you just had a true assessment of what a critical system looks like and the safeguards, you wouldn't use this election system. So I guess in order to answer your question, we need to pass a law. Let's just see if the existing machine infrastructure meets federal law right now on its face. It's clear that it doesn't, but
so who would Trump's attorney general be the person to look into that?
Yeah. So there would have to be a top down audit from the DOJ, a newly staff DOJ, attorney general, And I think what I would do is, if I was in that position, is I would make a recommendation that these machines cannot pass the sniff test from a critical infrastructure. In fact, the best ways are the old ways. And so if you want top notch security, you need to have closed system architecture, which is what a lot of nations across the world, they're using paper ballots. It's not like they don't have access to blockchain technologies and everything else, but there's a trust component where you're putting your trust in a third party at some point to handle that blockchain or that digital ledger to expedite the results. Because in theory, you could have end-to-end encryption and have something that's secure, but it would take forever to get a result. And so what you do with credit card processing is that you've got a third party vendor that effectively says, if there is fraud that's committed, we're on the hook for it, not you. We don't have that in the election space, and you never will.
Oh,
so yeah, I see this. I see this as a wonderful opportunity to strip things down and make sure that this is a locally empowered movement where everything's about certification at the county level. Everything with respect to administering elections is done with people that you can look in the eye, observe, and that's the way forward. And that's my prayer.
Right. You mentioned prayer. From a spiritual point of view, how do you interpret this election?
I'll give you a weird answer. My journey started 4 years ago behind my cabin when I saw what happened on January 6th. And I prayed. And I prayed prayers that I've never prayed before because I was desperate for my country and for my family. And I had a very, very supernatural experience. And it turned me into a different version of myself that is definitely more bold in the sharing of my faith and the love of my Savior and all of those things. But it's also maybe kind of this cracked, half unhinged person that people are kind of like, I don't know if I want to go all in with Clements over there. But after I get done with this interview, I'm driving up the mountain and I'm going back to the same place that I had this supernatural encounter to sit down and see if I can have a conversation through prayer with God. And the landscape's different. My cabin was burned down on the ground. So I'm actually going to be in a torched forest, just processing and taking a day to sit there and going, okay, all right, Lord, providentially, you've carried us this day. It wasn't my efforts. It wasn't John Zmirak's efforts. It was millions of people that were just doing what they could. And he delivered us through this massive miracle. I mean, yesterday was a miracle.
Yeah.
And I don't think that we should just go, okay, now I've got all the answers from here on out. Let's go ahead and take it from here. Let's await some inspiration and look for what God's going to tell me and tell you and listen to that small, still whisper. If you ask me what my heart's desire is on a personal level, it's that I don't want to waste the last 4 years in getting this victory and then letting it vanish right before our eyes over the next 4 years. So I would equate it to the last 4 years is like I'm going up a mountain and there's like a gale force wind that's making every step super, super difficult to get up the mountain. And with the victory that we just experienced, I feel like we finally have the wind at our back. Mm-hmm. And I would love to fight for election integrity with the president that's not going to have a DOJ that's going to lock me up. I would love to get to the bottom of this with tiger teams, with top national security clearances like the people that were in our film, to get to the bottom of every form of fraud so that we can avoid it and just root out all of the subversions in the system. And I don't know what position that would look like. I don't have the hubris to say, okay, Trump's going to go ahead and say, hey, I've got a position for you. I have no idea, but I know that I want to protect this country. There's something about being through this painful journey over the past 4 years where my name and reputation have absolutely been devastated, thinking, man, it would be really cool to be able to work with authority and work with resources and not like walk in a place where people just look at you and mock you. It's the first instinct is I'm going to mock you.
Yeah. It's
So
their go-to move because what we saw, the Republican Party has changed. It is now the party of the people, of the working class, of every race, every religion. And the Democrats are the party of the global elites who fly business class or fly charter or fly in their Gulfstreams and who live in gated communities insulated from the results of their disastrous policies, fueled by cheap labor. Trump has built a new coalition, and I think it's a very hopeful moment for people like you, especially who have devoted themselves so selflessly and patriotically in what seemed like a quixotic cause and kind of immolated themselves in the fires of patriotism. Speaking of people like that, I know you've done representation, you still do representation for political prisoners of January 6th. Do you think Trump will promptly and generously pardon them?
I hope so. I think he will. I mean, he's indicated that he will. And there's some wrinkles on how to do that because some people are on appeal that could potentially be exonerated. And you don't want the pardon to necessarily make those a moot, those appeals moot because you might
Well,
get
with Mike Flynn, he granted him a pardon of innocence, where
yeah.
and that maybe that could be the solution.
And I think the difference though is that Flynn was one person, and
Right.
now you have to start looking at how do I do a blanket pardon when there are some circumstances where some people's conduct was more salacious than others. I still think everyone that wasn't an FBI informant should be granted a full pardon. Um,
I
it,
think also we need to fire and prosecute the FBI officials who did things like the fake Whitmer kidnapping and then who were involved. The same guy, Dan Tuano, who supervised the Whitmer kidnapping fraud, was then in charge on January 6th. People
yeah.
like him have to go on trial.
So I haven't shared this with me. This is the first day that I'm actually sharing this. I've been representing Jake Lang behind the scenes, and I very, very cautious on when I enter in my appearance because at that point, all guns get directed. But he's set for trial on December 2nd. And we had a conversation this morning. Dave, do I go to trial knowing that there's a good chance that a pardon's going to be issued in January? Or do I wait till May, make it a moot issue? And honestly, the only person that it really bothers is going to be the attorneys. It's like, I'm going to be giving up 3 weeks of the holidays. I'm already tired. I've got to prepare. We've already kind of won, if that makes sense. We're going in if Trump is a man of his word. But what I was wrestling with him, like, this is your first chance to introduce evidence where the judge knows they don't have the same type of corrupt political cover of a Merrick Garland. Like, this might be the one case where we actually get evidence in, and maybe it doesn't matter, but wouldn't it be great to just see if the demeanor of the judge completely changes because Trump is about to show up and there's going to be a level of accountability. So part of me still wants to do it. Jake is probably the most prominent and most well-known J6er2. I mean, he's a bit of a marketer, but he's been in the full duration. And so we're praying about it. But yeah, ultimately, it's going to be a different feeling going into trial knowing that his freedom is not going to be in the hands of a DC jury. It's not going to be in the hands of that judge. It's actually going to be in the hands of President Trump. But it would be great on the record to see a judge course correct and give us the first jury trial victory out of all of the J6 cases. I want to be a part of that. And I hope we have the opportunity to prove his innocence at trial.
That's exciting. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to let you, and I'm going to get some much needed rest. God bless, and have a safe and spiritually productive retreat up on the mountain.
I will. Thank you, John.